What if I told you that long before the rise of Washington, before the ink of the Constitution dried, before Columbus even dared to cross the Atlantic, a grand civilization was already thriving on this land? Not just surviving, but thriving, with cities that rivaled those of Europe, with organized religion, government, monumental architecture, and astronomical science. A civilization that built pyramids, mapped the stars, and connected a continent through vast trade networks, all without metal, wheels, or writing. And yet, you probably never learned their names in school. Why is that? What happened to these people? And how did something so big disappear so completely? To find answers, we must go back nearly 1,000 years to the year 1050 AD, in the heart of what we now call the United States. In the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River, near present-day St. Louis, rose a city called Cahokia. At its height, it was the largest urban center north of Mexico. A city of 15,000 to 25,000 people, maybe even more. Imagine that, a North American metropolis during the same century that Notre Dame Cathedral was being constructed in Paris. Cahokia wasn't a village. It was a city-state. It sprawled across 6 square miles and contained over 120 earthen mounds, each one a feat of human engineering and sacred meaning. The largest of these, Monk's Mound, still stands today, rising 10 stories tall, made from millions of tons of hand-packed earth. No machinery, no beasts of burden, just human determination. It is the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the Americas. At its summit once stood a temple, a spiritual beacon visible for miles across the river valley. Standing atop it today, you can see the St. Louis skyline in the distance, a modern echo of ancient ambition. But Cahokia was more than just mounds. It was a center of science and culture, a place of astronomers and priests, diplomats and artisans. Surrounding the central plaza stood houses, gardens, granaries, and ceremonial buildings. And nearby, something extraordinary, a massive timber circle known today as Woodhenge. Built with tall cedar poles arranged in a perfect circle, Woodhenge was an ancient calendar aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. On the morning of the spring equinox, the sun would rise directly over a specific pole, marking the beginning of the agricultural year. These alignments weren't accidental. They were precise. This was a society deeply attuned to the rhythms of the cosmos. But how did Cahokia rise so quickly? And why here? Cahokia's success was rooted in its geography. Nestled near the convergence of major rivers, the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois, it became the crossroads of a continent. Goods flowed in from thousands of miles away, copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians. With these goods came ideas, rituals, alliances. Cahokia became not just a city, but a spiritual and economic hub, the beating heart of a civilization that stretched from the Great Plains to the Atlantic. But Cahokia wasn't alone. Across the eastern United States, other mound-building cultures were thriving. The Adna and Hopewell peoples, who lived from roughly 1000 BCE to 500 CE, built enormous ceremonial earthworks in present-day Ohio. Some of these structures were geometric marvels, perfect circles and squares carved into the landscape, so vast they can only be fully seen from the sky. Others, like the Great Serpent Mound, were shaped like animals, undulating across the hills in symbolic form. What were they for? Burial? Ceremony? Astronomy? Perhaps all three. The Serpent Mound, for instance, aligns with the summer solstice sunset. These weren't crude piles of dirt. These were messages written in the earth, aligned with the stars, meant to endure time itself. But perhaps the most haunting question is, what happened to them? By the 1300s, Cahokia was in decline. Its population dwindled. The mounds were no longer maintained. Why? Scholars believe it may have been a combination of factors. Deforestation led to soil erosion and flooding. Climate change brought longer droughts. Political unrest and internal conflict may have fractured the community, and diseases, likely introduced by indirect contact with early European expeditions, could have spread along trade routes before Europeans even arrived in person. The great city didn't fall overnight. It faded, slowly, silently, until only its bones, those sacred mounds, remained. Centuries later, when European settlers came upon these mounds, they were stunned. How could people they viewed as primitive have built such monuments? The answer should have been simple. They didn't. They inherited them. So began the myth of the mound builders. Early American writers and scientists refused to believe Native Americans had built the mounds. Instead, they conjured fantasies of a lost white race, ancient Egyptians, even survivors of Atlantis. Anything to avoid acknowledging the truth that indigenous civilizations in North America had created these wonders long before European arrival. Why would such myths take root? Because the real history threatened the very foundation of the settler colonial narrative. If native peoples had cities, calendars, governments, then they weren't savages. They weren't wanderers in the woods. They were civilized. And that meant that taking their land wasn't discovery. It was conquest. Today, archaeology, carbon dating, and oral histories have corrected the record. We now know these civilizations were built by the ancestors of modern native nations. The Choctaw, Osage, Natchez, and others still carry the memory of mound building traditions in their stories, ceremonies, and bloodlines. But the silence remains. These cities are rarely taught in schools. Their names are not etched into the national consciousness. There are no Hollywood epics about Cahokia, no textbooks tracing the rise and fall of the Hopewell Exchange Network. And so the myth persists that history in America began in 1492. But it didn't. It began thousands of years earlier, with the people who shaped the very land we live on. Their cities may have crumbled, their temples may have fallen, but their vision remains in the mounds that still rise from the fields, in the stories passed from elder to child, and in the sky where the stars still mark the seasons just as they always did. So next time you drive through the American Midwest and see a strange hill rising from the landscape, remember, it may not be a hill at all. It may be the last breath of a city that once touched the stars.